What we're doing now, we're talking about the current Master Duel format, which I think is warranted with how much the recent selection pack has changed. Let's be real, the game is not quite the same as it was last month. That means we are doing something that people have been asking for a lot recently, which is we're doing an updated tier list with a little bit of an overview of the metagame. I've tried to include not just the obvious picks, but also some other things that I have a certain amount of faith in. It's a very high power format. The standard for what your deck needs to be doing in order to compete in this current format at a high competitive level has definitely changed. And I do want to lead off with Fiendsmith, Azamina, Snakeye, the most powerful deck in the game right now, and I don't think anything else really comes close. That deck is very, very strong. The amount of pushes this deck has, from Fiendsmith Engine to Bonfire to Witch to Deception to your normal summon Snakeye cards, like, it's just so powerful. And the amount of things it can extend through is honestly insane. The end board of this deck is incredible. You've got the most dangerous mixes of everything. Like, you've got Omni Negates, you've got stuff from the graveyard in the form of Promethean Princess, you have Divine Temple set up so the IP Masquerena is in your spell trap zone so that you're not super weak to something like Dark Ruler no more. And I think if this deck stays around in this exact shape or form, it is going to be by far the most played deck and the deck to beat in the upcoming Duelist Cup. I personally am expecting a Forbidden and Limited List update before the Duelist Cup. I don't think they're going to hit Fiendsmith or Azamina because those cards just came out, but I do think there's a realistic chance they're gonna have to like hit Snake Eyes. Just a little bit of advice in terms of how to beat this deck, which it always comes with an asterisk because this deck is hard to beat, but this deck is weak to hand traps. The problem is, in order to make sure they don't actually like explode and combo on you, you do need to draw like 2 or 3 hand traps at least. It's not as simple as like, oh, I'm gonna open an impermanence and that's gonna be enough, because if they have one extender, they play through that impermanence like it never happened. The obvious answer is Resolve Maxi or Fuvalos, but they will obviously play a lot of answers to those. Other than that, a whole lot of those Imperm, Veiler, Mourner, Ghost Ogre for Deception, even Retaliating Sea for the Hallowed Azamina lines is good. Bestials are strong for the Engraver package. Basically, if you want to build a deck that just beats that deck, you just gotta find the deck that can play the most hand trap. They can play around Droll if they go Diabellstar into Original instead of Deception, but yeah, most of the time Droll is going to be pretty good too. I just gave the category some funny names. We're going to be rating decks based on aura today. Yubel Fiendsmith is a deck that is weird for me to evaluate because I know for a fact that this deck is very, very powerful. This deck definitely has strong aura. However, the problem with Fiendsmith Yubel is essentially that it is just trying to do the exact same thing as Snake Eyes, but it is just worse at it. The Yubel deck is maybe a little bit more broken going first, even though it is much weaker into Fuvalos. Like the Snake Eye deck, sometimes you resolve Fuvalos against it and they can still do something like, hey, IP Masquerena, Ilia Sylvia in like 2 summons from the extra deck, which is like you get 2 draws, but they have IP into SP and an Omni Negate with like the field spell. The Yubel deck basically has no plan B. All they can do is like Phantom Pass. The deck also bricks a decent amount. Aerial Eater is missing. Overall, the deck is still incredibly scary though, especially if it gets to go first. So that deck is strong aura. I think it's going to be towards the bottom of this category though. If you want to play this deck, you can definitely climb with it. You could even do well in the Duelist Cup with it. However, I don't see a reason from a competitive standpoint to play this deck over Snake Eye. Snake Eye is just that deck, but better. Dragon Link is a deck that originally I was just going to put it into weak. However, I do think there's one thing that's going for Dragon Link, which is that this is one of those decks that can play a lot of hand traps and a lot of Bestials, and that's fine. It's probably towards the end of Solid. There's going to be games where your opponents will just overwhelm the amount of disruption you have. That's going to happen, but overall, the deck is still going to be fine. Gimmick Puppet got no aura right now. You're not winning a single time if you go second unless you maxi someone. People are going to play a lot of hand traps because they are forced to, with Snake Eye and Yubel in the mix, and also like White Forest and stuff. Like, hand traps are necessary right now. That is going to obviously hurt Gimmick Puppet. I'm only putting it into no aura because I hate the deck. In reality, it's probably still good enough for weak. It's probably not that bad, but honestly, playing this deck right now when everyone is on Bestials, everyone is on a bunch of hand traps, it just doesn't seem smart. Kashtira, I wanted to mention 2 things. Like, I want to make a distinction between Kashtira cards and the Kashtira deck. The Kashtira deck, personally, I think is just okay. It's like between weak and at the very bottom of solid. The thing that is kind of carrying this deck is the strengths of Kashtira, Unicorn, and Fenrir right now. Specifically, Unicorn is a card that is very, very powerful into Fiendsmith decks because most Fiendsmith decks only play one copy of most of the extra deck. And because all of their extra deck relies on each other, if you end up taking away one Requiem, you are essentially taking 3 or 4 cards out of their extra deck. Which is why also in a lot of other decks, you see people play Kashtira, Unicorn, and Birth and Fenrir as a splash. You see that in some Snake Eye lists, in some Yubel decks, in some White Forest, in a whole bunch of decks, you see those cards. That is because Unicorn is exceptionally strong right now. Kashtira itself, the deck, I would probably put in weak. I think it's too inconsistent because the cards have been hit to oblivion. Mathmech, my beloved. I decided to include Mathmech because I think the concept of the deck is not terrible right now. I think it is towards the bottom of solid. There's been formats where I thought this deck was actually a good pick, even though I would obviously never play it. Right now, it has a couple things going for it, which is obviously, you know, play a whole bunch of hand traps. And that's good. That's going to help you beat Snake Eyes and White Forest. However, everyone else is doing that too, including Bystials. And that's a big problem. Bystials are very good against Mathmech. Fuvalos is also incredibly good against Mathmech. So I think overall that just makes the deck like relatively average to weak almost. Branded's just an average deck right now. It has gotten consistency buffs, which I think is cool. However, I think the only win condition for Branded is really locking people out of the game right now, and Bystials are very good at preventing that. This deck going second is very, very unfavored into the Azamina combo piles because this deck typically just doesn't have enough hand traps to compete going second with those decks. Going first, you are still required to basically lock your opponent out of the game because a quote-unquote fair normal Branded board, most Snake Eye hands will just destroy that. You basically have to lock them out of the game. But the problem is, even then, if they hard draw Deception, right, they can out whatever lock you're putting onto them. Now that Gimmick Puppet of Nightmare isn't legal anymore, there's no lingering lock anymore. I don't know, maybe you can find something with the new Light and Darkness Dragon that is consistent enough and beats people well enough, but overall I just think like you're struggling a decent amount with Bystials. I wouldn't recommend this deck. You're still going to be able to do fine with this, and that's the thing I want to mention. Everything I'm going to end up putting like in this middle-ish tier here, solid, they are 100% good enough to make like Master 1 with if you play them well. And if that's your favorite deck, like by all means you can play it. It's just not among the top decks right now. Centurion, unfortunately, this deck ever since it's gotten released has been slowly but surely moving down the tier list, and unfortunately right now is the point where I'm gonna have to start calling Centurion weak, which is unfortunate because I really like this deck. You guys know that I like the mid-rangey style of it. This deck is just not resilient enough. This deck's end board is just not strong enough right now unless you get completely uninterrupted. However, all the most common hand traps in the format are kind of solid against Centurion, you know, Imperm Veiler, Ash, Ghost Ogre. The only good thing about Centurion is that it doesn't care about Molch Armies that much. The problem is your opponent doesn't even need to draw 3 cards off of Molch Army to beat your Centurion board. If you make a normal Centurion board, like most of the meta decks will just run over it. You are super reliant on drawing a lot of non-engine with your combos, and the problem is Centurion, despite having decent room for non-engine, there's other decks that can just do that better. So I don't think this deck is strong right now. Exodia is a deck I included because it just got added to the game, and I figured it'd be a deck that a lot of people would be interested in. However, I personally think from a competitive standpoint, unfortunately, the Exodia deck has no real appeal to it. It's just not a strong deck. From the engine itself, you're creating a spell trap negation and a trap card that can wipe the opponent's entire board. A lot of people will be able to play through this, which ultimately ends up turning your deck into the sort of like flip a floodgate and try to win with it approach that is kind of whack, honestly. It's kind of unfortunate. I feel like this deck had the potential to be kind of cool, but then they turned it into a deck that isn't strong enough to win without floodgates. On top of that, you're playing 5 bricks in your deck, which is very annoying. You can tell me whatever you want. That's a huge downside. Even if you play 55, 50, 60 cards, like you're gonna draw those cards a decent amount. Going second, this deck has almost no game. From a competitive perspective, there's no real reason to play the Exodia deck. Unfortunately, that's what I have to tell you. I guess you have like a 0.00001 chance to draw all 5 pieces of Exodia, and that'd be really cool. Fiendsmith, I included here because obviously we've already talked about Fiendsmith plenty, and it is part of plenty of decks, but I wanted to mention Fiendsmith specifically because I want to talk just for a moment about the position of the Fiendsmith engine as a whole in the format, and maybe also mention, which if you've just been playing Master Duel, you might not be aware of this, but in the TCG, there has been a pure Fiendsmith Fiendsmith deck, sort of. In theory, that'd be a pretty good concept, because that is the type of deck that just aims to play as many hand traps as possible and just relies on the Fiendsmith engine to apply some amount of pressure and get you there over the course of a longer, grindier game, because the Fiendsmith is very, very good at recursion every single turn, right? Like, it'll come back every turn, you reshuffle your stuff into the deck every turn, and that sort of deck is a thing in Master Duel. People have been playing around with it. Emra sent me a version of it that we played on stream recently, where you just play a couple of normal summons that turn into full Fiendsmith combo, like Cyber's Gadget, because that's 3 bodies with a normal summon. I think at the moment, though, I'm not going to put it higher than solid. Maybe you can find a way to make it work. However, the biggest problem here, and once again, this is something that everyone who's been playing the TCG knows this already, but we're missing cards for Fiendsmith. Lacrima the Crimson Tears, and we're missing Fiendsmith Agnum Day, and also Necrocrypt Princess. What that means is you simply don't have as strong of a grind game. Any 2 bodies is not full Fiendsmith combo in Master Duel, because you're going to make Moon, you're going to make Requiem, you're going to tribute Requiem, summon the Engraver, and then you have no way to get the Engraver off of the field without Necroquip. In the TCG, you go summon Lacrima, send Fiendsmith Engraver from the deck, bring back Engraver, make sequence, like you have full combo there. In Master Duel, that is not possible. What is also not possible is sending Fiendsmith in Paradise on your opponent's turn with Lacrima the Crimson Tears, which is an additional interruption, which is super huge in those grindy game states that Fiendsmith creates, right? And so those 2 things missing for this deck makes me even wonder if this is the best approach to a hand trap deck. Maybe it's just because I'm looking at it through the lens of someone who's been playing that deck in the TCG, so I'm just noticing the differences. Like, it just feels so weak in comparison. The concept is still fine, a lot of hand traps, grind with Fiendsmith, but you're gonna encounter a bunch of games where you're gonna be like, damn, if I had Lacrima, if I had Necroquip, I'd be winning this game, but I won't. A little annoying. Labrynth is a solid deck right now. I do think it struggles a fair amount. I think the only version of Labrynth that I could potentially see is Furniture Labrynth with a heavy hand trap count. I do think you have some struggles in the grind game. You need to stop your opponent from comboing, basically, or like throw a Fuva or Maxi at them, and then it's fine. Other than that, I don't see much going on for Labrynth right now. The deck isn't bad by any means, but it's also not higher than this. Maybe even slightly under, like a deck with more hand traps and Bystials like Dragon Link. It's probably weaker than Branded, somewhere here. As much as I like Melodious, and as much as people are telling me, hey, I'm having a lot of fun with Melodious in ladder right now, Melodious is probably around here. The deck is just pretty average at a lot of things. It has a decent amount of non-engine slots, but nothing crazy. It has decent amount of game into other hand traps like Imperm Veiler, Mourner, whatever. It's not great into Retaliating Sea, which people are playing. It's not great into Fuva, but it is still a capable deck overall. White Forest Runic, unfortunately, is not the way to go if you're trying to play White Forest. We just spent an entire stream playing White Forest Azamina, and the White Forest Azamina deck is actually quite strong. Once again, the White Forest Azamina deck has a similar problem than Yubel Fiendsmith. It's a very powerful deck, but there's no real reason to play that deck over Snake Eyes. The White Forest Azamina deck I would put here. I think it's better than Yubel. It's a very good deck, but it's not better than Snake Eyes. It doesn't qualify as the best deck. White Forest Runic, unfortunately, and as much as I love this deck, but it's not good right now. Runic decks in general, you don't have enough non-engine space to win going second. Going first, Fuvalos is a problem, Maxi is a problem. This deck is not good right now. Let's talk about some other Fiendsmith brews that I think have some a solid, some of a not so solid position in the format right now. Tearlaments Fiendsmith is a deck that I've seen some people mention as kind of like their go-to fun deck to play in the format, because Fiendsmith obviously sometimes a good mill, but also if you draw it, you can make Beatrice with it, which is pretty strong in Tearlaments, and it just gives the deck like another push. So it ends up being like typically those like 60 cards, Slop, Tearlament, just Gamba, and Engraver just helps you a little bit, you know? That deck is probably fun. I can see why people like it. I think right now it's got no business really being played in the metagame. Like, it's going to be terrible going second, and going first, you still need to hit the Gamba. I do not think it belongs into solid. Like, that deck is just not great, I think. Also due to the popularity of Bystials and a whole lot of other things. Like, I just don't think that deck's consistently winning right now. Chimera, there's 2 approaches I've seen. There's just Chimera Fiendsmith, which is a deck that was popular in the TCG. You basically just use the Chimera cards to bridge into Fiendsmith combos, because you can summon the Baphomet that sends one from deck to the graveyard, and you send the Evil Hero Sinister Necrom, and the Evil Hero Sinister Necrom summons out Evil Hero Adusted Gold, and that turns into full Fiendsmith combo. You do some Chimera Chimera stuff on top of that. It's a neat deck. It's just a little bricky. Sometimes if you don't have access to Chimera fusion, it's a little bit too easy to stop. Cards like Imperm, Veiler, Droll, Ash on your first search or first attempt to search can be pretty devastating with the deck. Overall, I think it is just solid, but it is playable. There's also a version that puts Azamina cards on top of all that and plays the new Azamina LZ with the combo in mind where like you special the Azamina LZ, you fuse with it into Azamina Mo Regina. Mo Regina brings back the LZ from the graveyard, then you make Chaos Angel with it and you search a Sinful Spoils card. That version of the deck I think is the bottom of the strong decks. I think that deck is pretty good. Once again, you heard me say this a lot about the decks that I put into strong. They are still weaker than Snake Eyes. Like, this is a strong combo deck. This deck can play through a lot of stuff. This deck can push through boards. This deck can make very, very powerful boards going first, but it just is not the best deck because there's other decks that do that better. But it is powerful, especially if you master it. Like, it's the kind of deck that, like, in the beginning, it's going to be a little overwhelming with the amount of options that you have. It's pretty good, I think. Rescue Ace Fiendsmith is a deck that I've seen people talk about because that was also a thing in the TCG where you can use Fiendsmith as like a kind of extender for Rescue Ace that also can be a starter because you can do the whole Beatrice thing. You send Hydrant and bring it back with Promethean Princess. Just how it can be a starter for Snake Eyes, it can also be a starter for Rescue Ace. That deck obviously has the advantage of it's a little bit better into Fuvalos with some hands because like you can just sometimes get to your Turbulence relatively fast. If your opponent doesn't have Fuva or Maxi, you have some pretty high ceiling combo lines as well. I think that deck is like solid. I have a hard time fully evaluating it because I just don't run into it very much, but I just remember this deck from the TCG and it was pretty good in the TCG, and I can see it being good in Master Duel as well. I don't think it's better than the decks up here, but it's definitely fine. We've got Ritual Beast. I just don't see this deck anymore, man. I also don't think it is particularly good right now. Maybe one of its perks was that it was very good during Tenpai's domination. Right now, everyone on Fuva, everyone on Maxi, Shifter at 1, here Max. Sky Striker. Oh my god, yes, I love this new animation solo mode. Not a good deck right now. Let's make use of the no aura category. Let's throw these two decks down here. They got no aura right now. Sky Striker is very weak. The problem is if you're trying to play a deck with board breakers, it would probably be Sky Striker right now. You would have to draw a lot of them, like Dark Ruler, Thrust, Talons, evenly match and stuff like that. Then maybe you have a chance, but then most of the time their follow-up will probably still be enough to kill you. It's probably slightly under the Exodia deck, to be honest. To give the Exodia deck some credit, just after moving it down to no aura. Here's a little bit of a sleeper pick for you. I think Fire King Azamina Snake Eye. This is the one deck that I think could rival Snake Eyes, like pure Snake Eyes. I'm not putting it up there because I haven't played it yet myself. A little more bricky than Snake Eyes, but it solves one pretty big problem for pure Snake Eye, and that's Fuvalos, which is in everyone's deck right now. The Fire King cards give you a pretty good alternative line to actually end on a really, really good board even under Fuvalos. Yeah, Jesse told me this as well. Jesse said he really liked playing that deck. This would have been like last December, I think, or last November when we had YCS Bologna. Most people were playing, I think, Snake Eye, Fiendsmith, Azamina, but like the Fire King version was also an option, and some people preferred that because it was a little better into Fuvalos. And so I think this is the only other deck that I think could seriously be a top tier contender next to just Snake Eye Fiendsmith. I think my opinion on Tenpai is going to be a little controversial here. What I constantly hear when I talk about Tenpai on stream is like people saying like, oh, this deck is still way too powerful. That deck needs to go. The reason why people say this is because they experience a lot of unfun games against Tenpai. I don't think Tenpai is that good right now because the deck has very little good engine cards. And so what ends up happening is, yes, you can hand trap your opponent to death. The problem is most of the time you're not even beating a single Imperm. The only cards that can beat Imperm are like 2 Kaiman, 1 Chandra, 1 Sangan summoning. Everything else is just a normal summon. People have started to play freaking Gold Sarcophagus with Blaster to get an extra push. It's so difficult. Not only do you have to draw 2 or 3 hand traps to stop these combo decks from comboing because everyone else is playing Imperm and Veiler and stuff, you have to draw starter plus extender to even win. I don't think that deck is that good. The problem is people still complain about it because it's not fun to play against. And I think that still warrants that the deck probably should be hit another time. Because it's best of 1 and Tenpai just isn't a fun concept in best of 1, and that's why people complain about it. I think it's somewhere in solid. Honestly, genuinely, I don't think this deck is that powerful. It's annoying and it should be hit again. I don't think it's that good. It depends what rank you're at. Tenpai is a crazy deck to farm other rogue decks with because it's just like they got no business beating that deck. If other people are playing the top tier decks, Fire King, Snake Eye Fiendsmith, Chimera, Yubel, like those decks, Tenpai will not do super well against them. Voiceless Voice is slightly better than Centurion, but these mid-range decks are struggling right now. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments how stupid some of my takes are. Other than that, I hope it helps you evaluate the format a little bit for the upcoming season and upcoming Duelist Cup. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye, everybody.